Hello, everyone. Hello. Hi. Welcome. I'm Dr. Elspeth van Veeren. I'm an associate professor in the School of Sociology and Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol, but I'm also a member of the steering group of SPIN, and it's in that capacity that I welcome you here today. SPIN is the Secrecy, Power and Ignorance Research Network, which is based in the southwest of the UK. It's a multidisciplinary network spanning several institutions and made up of scholars of all levels. We have undergraduates up to very senior professors. And we have a broad set of interests that are all interconnected with this idea of understanding and exploring what it means to unpack the politics of unknowing. So this afternoon, I'm delighted to welcome you to the next event in our series funded by the Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership, who are co-hosting this evening. Over the past year, we've delivered a series of lectures, panels, and workshops on the theme of secrecy and ignorance in order to support the development of this exciting line of research and draw new researchers to our community. The final activities being the first SPIN colloquium taking place in Bristol in December, and a series of panels at the next International Studies Association convention taking place in March in Montreal. Today, however, is a bit special because it's one of our, not only is it one of our penultimate events, but we're welcoming one of our own, Professor Brian Rappert from the University of Exeter, to celebrate the publication of his latest book, Performing Deception. So Brian is Professor of Science, Technology, and Public Affairs at the University of Exeter, and he focuses on the social and ethical dilemmas of expertise and information management. Brian has researched and written on the politics of information flows surrounding disease control, diplomacy, and war. But more recently, he's turned his attention to understanding what we mean by revelation, what we consider to be a key, an underexplored area associated with secrecy, which is where his latest book, Performing Deception, comes in. So in Performing Deception, as Brian will no doubt cover this evening, he reconstructs the practice of entertainment magic, analyzing it through the lens of perception, deception, and learning, while studying conjuring himself in order to explore the way secrecy and deception are woven into social interactions, as well as the illusionary and paradoxical status of expertise. So we're very excited to hear him talk more about this project. But alongside Brian, as his respondents, we welcome Dr. Claire Burchell, who's Professor of Contemporary Culture at King's College London and the author of Radical Secrecy, The Ends of Transparency in Datafied America, Share Valence, The Dangers of Openly Sharing and Covertly Collecting Data, and Knowledge Goes Pop, From Conspiracy Theory to Gossip. We also welcome Dr. Susan Merritt, who's a lecturer at the School of Information at San Jose State University, co-editor of Government Secrecy, Classic and Contemporary Readings, and managing editor of the journal Secrecy and Society, as well as Professor Todd Landman, Professor of Political Science and Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Social Sciences at the University of Nottingham, Executive Director of the Rights Lab. But for today, he is also here in his capacity with his stage name of the Academic Magician. We will be recording Brian's talk today, which will be made available on the SPIN YouTube channel. Brian will speak for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, followed by each of our guests, and we'll end the session with a discussion and opportunity for comments and questions from the audience. So please do share those or drop them into the chat box, which I'll keep an eye on. I'm therefore delighted, without any more preamble, to welcome everyone today, to say thank you to our guests, to say thank you to you for coming, and I'll turn over to Brian to start his talk.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that, Elspeth, and thanks everyone for coming in, taking the time out to kind of share in this long-term ambition I had to take up entertainment magic. So let me see if I can manage with the sharing the screens too. Let me just bring up my presentation. Okay, I think you can see that. Okay, yeah, so as Elspeth said, I'm just going to offer some initial kind of reflections on the book for those of you who have read it, for those of you who haven't read it. And yeah, then we'll move on to our respondents and we'll see where we go from there. So, I'm kind of seeing the list of people here and I'm thinking, probably some of you might be wondering, why would someone want to study magic? And for me, it's because there's some really interesting questions that come up with it. Magicians are kind of students of the mundane, and they ask a lot of interesting questions like how can we learn to be natural? This is a key, it's a key characteristic in the kind of magic I do. Magicians are performers, but they're also performers that use deception And so they ask questions like, well, how can we care for others? How can we care for ourselves through being deceptive? And one of the things that I think is really fascinating about magic is that learning magic is a process of learning about the limits of perception, memory, and cognition through our very kind of perception, memory, and cognition. Okay, and that raises a lot of interesting questions, which maybe I'll get onto some of them a little bit later on. So there's really interesting questions to be asked here through magic. And also, I think magic is a fascinating topic for study because it involves a lot of questions about relations. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of those relations later, some of those aspects of it. But in this slide, what I want to highlight here is the way in which, well, this is the way I approached it, that magic entails certain what we might think of as opposing but coexisting tendencies and features. And yeah, the book is really structured around these kinds of what seem like dichotomies, but are not. And the question I want to ask throughout the book are, how are things that look like opposites, how are they related? And just to say that a lot of the inspiration for this derived from this lovely book by Baxter and Montgomery called Relating. They're interested in interpersonal relationships, relationships between couples. And as psychologists, they were interested in thinking about, well, how do we understand different couples and their characteristics? And one of the ways in which you could do that is you could say, well, there are some couples that are a little bit more based on autonomy, the autonomy of individuals, and some that are based on more connection. And what Baxter and Montgomery want to do is to say, well, no, actually, these concepts are very much interrelated. It's only because we can talk about a kind of notion of disconnect that we can talk about how we connect with people. Sometimes it's only through our relations with other people that we think about our own autonomy, right? And so they're trying to bring and I think they brought a very sophisticated approach to thinking about interpersonal relations. And I really took a lot of inspiration from that in the structure of this performing deception book. So just to tell you about one of those in a little bit more detail, for instance, there's a chapter in the book about magicians' autobiographies. And if you think about autobiographies, right, they're often based on a kind of what's been called a kind of referential pack. The idea that the author is kind of telling you what they understand to be true, and they're giving you a kind of authentic image of themselves. But one of the interesting things about magicians, right, is that they're deceivers. So how, if you're going to tell a story about yourself, how do you mix this desire to be authentic with the idea that you are very skilled in pretense? And that was one of the things I was interested in exploring to what extent magicians even consider truth-telling relevant in their autobiographies, and then how do they advance notions of what's right and what's wrong to do. And a lot of magicians have very considered and very strong opinions about this sort of thing. So yeah, how do you kind of put all that together with the idea that someone is a kind of skilled deceiver? All right, so as Elspeth alluded to, this book maybe is a little bit different than a lot of academic books in so much as I really took the kind of center spine of this in terms of the empirical work is my own attempts to become an entertainment magician. So back in end of 2017, as someone with no prior familiarity with how to do any kind of magic, I started to say an autoethnographic study of learning entertainment magic. So this is a very special photo for me. The first instructions that I read, they said, spread the cards out on the table, and I spread the cards out and I took a photo because I said this might be important one day. And anyway, so yeah. So I read instructional books. I had various people over to my house and recorded sessions of me kind of doing magic with them. I got taught by some very nice magicians online and face to face. And yeah, I read all autobiographies, and also I became a performing magician. I've probably done about, I don't know, maybe about 30-page shows now, in various forums, mainly through a kind of local art center. And I mean, in my own way, right, and in my own style, which I'll talk about later. yeah, this is something that I do. Okay, so I kind of already talked about this idea of how things that look like opposites come together, and I just want to kind of continue on that theme, and again, maybe for people who, most people here aren't going to be having lots of familiarity with entertainment magic, I just want to highlight some things that I think are interesting about this as an art, and these are themes I touch on in the book, but I'll just kind of briefly cover them now. So yeah, so some issues of doubleness. Yeah, so magicians are performers, and they're usually trying to entertain people, although not necessarily always. But anyway, so there's a desire there to be responsive to audiences, and maybe, right, in normal life we think that being responsive to the needs of others isn't very conducive with trying to deceive them. Maybe sometimes we do, but anyway, for magicians, right, the whole focus on secrecy and deception takes a little bit of a different turn. Here's a quote from Mike Weber. I just really like this quote. I kind of show it every time I talk about magic, right? The idea is that magicians don't keep secrets from the audience; they keep them for the audience, right? That's why they hide things and so on. And yet it's a little bit more complicated than this. Magicians regularly realize that the secrets they keep may have more to do with kind of projecting an aura about magic, or giving them maybe a sense of kind of grandiose to themselves and their skills. So there's all these kinds of tensions within magic about the role of secrets. Another big theme when magicians come together and talk about their work is the idea of control. The idea of kind of maintaining control of an audience, and yeah, here's a prominent writer on magic giving it to you. Always remain in control. But okay, and yet, it's a little bit more complicated than that too. While there's a desire for magicians to control, they also want to create a kind of emotional engagement with their audience. And that means kind of being responsive to the audience, not just kind of getting a grip on them and pushing them around or something like that. But magicians too, I mean, they, professional magicians, people who do it for a living, right? I mean, they don't do what they do according to their own kind of whims and predilections, right? They have to work for others, right? So to do for another is kind of, to do by another. Okay, so that's a dynamic. And also too, then, within magicians, discussions of magicians, there is often a great importance placed on the skill of being able to handle the heckler. And when situations don't go right, and being able to kind of manage and kind of get through somehow. So anyway, there's all these kind of interesting ways in which there's this kind of tension-ridden place for control in magic. And that's certainly a kind of key theme in the book. Also, magic's really interesting for the kind of standing of material objects, right? Magicians, maybe there's a form of magic called mentalism, where you're more likely not to have some objects in front of you, okay? But generally speaking, almost all kinds of forms of magic, right, have some sort of props and so on, and these hold a kind of complex status. I think in a lot of areas in which I work, there's a desire to not think about the material world as just merely a set of objects. We think about the environments and so on, right? We want to kind of, how do we kind of respect or something like that, or give value to objects, right? A lot of times, magicians are trying to achieve the exact opposite aim. They're trying to convince you that the objects they're working with are ordinary, off the rack, nothing to see here, right? They're kind of, just kind of mere objects, something you don't even have to think about. And yet, magicians do this, but they're also very kind of, concerned about what that might lead audiences to do. Audiences might ask, say, well, can I keep this Rubik's Cube then, since I paid you 250 pounds, to whatever, come to my wedding and do your thing. And if that Rubik's Cube ends up being a kind of specially designed one, well, it might end up costing the magician, right? so anyway, there's a complex relation to objects. Okay, just to kind of finish off the kind of things I want to say about, as an introduction to the book. Yeah, so, because it's about a process of learning, there's a very much a kind of individual approach and orientation to magic that comes out here. I know maybe a lot of magicians, right, would say, well, this is not my kind of experience. I mean, I'm not trying to advance my experience as representative of all magicians or something like that. That would be silly, obviously. But I'm just trying to learn through those experiences. So let me tell you a little bit about kind of a little bit about my orientation to the magic that I do. For me, magic is a method. Right? It's a method for learning about myself and hopefully learning with other people about social relations. So in this regard, I can say, one of the things that I kind of learned to do through my shows is to ask audiences how they think magic's done. Right? So I'll do a little something and I'll say, well, let's call that magic. And how do you think that was done? I'm interested in people's responses to this. And one of the reasons I'm interested is that, maybe now I don't know, maybe I've asked that kind of question, maybe, I don't know, 60 events, I don't know, just kind of making up a kind of number there. But all that time, right, I've never had someone point to their own role as an audience member in actively helping the magic take place. The most maybe that I would ever get of some sort of acknowledgement that the audience is playing any kind of role here is in the idea that we're here to be fooled. But for me, right, magic is very much a kind of interpersonal event. It's more like a joke. This is the joke I make, right, in my sessions sometimes. I think magic's like a joke, right? There's no audience. It's not really clear you can tell a joke. And if there's no audience, it's not really clear magic can happen. So a lot of what I do in my shows is I get people to think about how we're doing this together. Okay, and then just there's a couple more avenues of this just to finish off. I can't help but bring up this particular aspect of some of the shows since we're online here. So how do magicians try to be responsive to their audiences? I mean, one of the ways in which that tradition takes place is that you kind of look people in the eye, right? And doing magic on Zoom, which I had to do over the pandemic, I nearly cried every time I had to do it. But when I did it, online in the pandemic, right? There's this really interesting dynamic because if I'm actually kind of looking. If I'm seen to be looking at you, which I guess I am now, right? Okay, so I'm actually not looking at you, right? If I wanted to look at you, I'd be looking at you over here. So now I can see Elspeth, right? But now I can't. Okay, and it's very interesting this situation, and my attention to this was brought by an audience member, a friend of mine, who was at my first online performance. And at that online performance, I basically had the camera focused in on my hands on the table because I thought people would want to see the cards really closely. But actually, what she said is she wants to see me as a person, but she wants to see the eye contact, right? And she said this, despite kind of clearly kind of acknowledging that she knew I wasn't making eye contact with her as I looked into the camera, right? But she wanted to feel that was taking place. And for me, it's, this is kind of one of the interesting ways in which, we create fictions all the time, okay? This fiction now of kind of me looking at you, right? And which is better, right? Me looking over here or me looking over, okay, but I'm not looking at you, of course. And yet we can still want this kind of interaction all the same. Okay, then just as a last point, so yeah, I said earlier, right? One of the interesting things about magic is it involves developing an eye, right? You're trying to train your senses, right, in a way in which, you haven't trained them in the past. And, this is like a lot of skilled activities, right? But what do you learn through magic? What you learn through magic is that the senses can be easily deceived. So an interesting question in that regard then is, well, how do expert magicians, teachers, how do they go about trying to teach students? And particularly, how does that then relate to what it means to orientate to our senses? Like, can we understand the world around us? Can we see what's before us? This was one of my teachers, Danny De Ortez. I really like him as a performer. And, part of the book involves an analysis of a masterclass that he put on, which he very kindly allowed me to record. And I was kind of interested in this question about, like, where do the senses come in? And one of the having recorded Danny's session and gone through it in some detail, it's very interesting because he does a lot of different kinds of moves and orientations to the senses. He wants us to watch what he does. He wants us to set that aside. He tells us to disregard what we know because of what we see, because of what we already know. He asks us to, at times he just tells us what we're experiencing and what we're seeing. He asks what we can comprehend. He asks us to judge things with foreknowledge. He asks us to regard things because of our knowledge. And anyway, it's just a whole kind of kaleidoscope of orientations to the senses. And for me, yeah, so what does learning magic entail, right? And part of it is being able to adopt these different ways of understanding kind of what's before us and whether what we see can be trusted. And for Danny, who's considered kind of world-leading expert in magic and so on, I mean, for him to be considered an expert, he needs to somehow be so convincing, right, that he can he can tell you what you're kind of experiencing as part of his training sessions. And that was one of the things I was interested in analyzing about about this kind of training. So yeah, so magic for me, I don't know, it's a little bit like that, right? There's all sorts of things going on. And then, just to finish, to say, ta-da, whatever. This is the book that came out. There are actually 3 forms of deception on this cover for the book. I am offering a prize for anyone who can find 2 of those. Okay, so if you can find 2 and you're that keen, right? There you go. Let me know and you'll get your prize in the post if you're correct, right?